Rodney King. He's a man who, well, he was thrust into history, becoming this instantaneous global symbol of injustice.
Right.
And not really by choice, but almost by accident. In just 81 seconds of shaky, grainy video, his story completely changed the conversation around American policing, media, and, race relations in the early 1990s.
It really did.
The story of King it's complex, it's tragic, and it's just so pivotal. So our mission today is to really explore this history. We want to synthesize the detailed historical accounts of the 1991 beating and then the controversial legal proceedings that followed.
And the riots, the catastrophic riots they ignited across Los Angeles.
Exactly. And King's long, complicated, and often very tragic life in the years after the incident. We're trying to move beyond just that 81-second clip to really understand the facts of a tragedy and its profound impact.
And it's crucial to establish right from the start that the events around King's arrest on March 3rd, 1991, this wasn't just some isolated incident of excessive force.
No, it was a flashpoint.
It was a flashpoint. It ignited these volatile social and racial issues that had been building between the African-American community and law enforcement in Los Angeles for decades.
Right.
This incident gave everyone a visible, irrefutable document of that tension. It was a piece of visual evidence that the entire country and the world was sort of forced to confront at the same time. It held a mirror up to all this systemic inequality.
Okay, so let's unpack this by starting with a man before the moment. Because I think understanding his personal history really helps us understand the decisions he made that night.
Absolutely.
Rodney King was born in Sacramento in 1965, and he grew up in Altadena, California. And we know from some of the biographical sources that he carried this early inspiration with him. He often spoke about his high school social science teacher, a man named Robert E. Jones.
And that personal context is important, but, if we really want to understand why he fled from the police that night, we have to look at his prior legal history. In 1989, King was convicted of robbery in Monterey Park. And this wasn't a minor thing. The source material details that he threatened a Korean store owner with an iron bar, he struck the owner, and he stole about $200.
So that's a serious offense that resulted in a serious sentence.
Exactly. He was sentenced to 2 years in state prison, but he was released on parole in December of 1990 after serving 1 year.
So he had only been out for a few months.
Just a few months. And that is the powerful, immediate motivation for his actions. Any new serious offense, especially something like a DUI, would be an automatic parole violation. It would send him straight back to prison to serve the rest of that sentence.
That high-stakes motivation brings us to the night itself, March 3rd, 1991. King was driving a 1987 Hyundai Excel with two of his friends, Brian Allen and Freddie Helms.
Right, and they've been watching basketball and drinking at a friend's house in Los Angeles, which, helps explain the later toxicology reports.
So the initial events, they unfold around 12:30 in the morning.
Yes. The pursuit was started by California Highway Patrol officers, specifically Tim and Melanie Singer. They clocked King's vehicle speeding on the Foothill Freeway, the I-210, and the chase immediately became incredibly intense and dangerous.
The speeds reported they're astonishing. King reached 117 miles per hour.
117.
This wasn't just a failure to pull over. This was a desperate high-speed flight. And when you know about the parole violation hanging over his head, it's almost understandable.
It was an immediate escalation, and it didn't just stay on the freeway. King exits the I-210 near the Hanson Dam recreation area, and the pursuit continues through these quiet residential streets at speeds up to 80 miles per hour.
Running red lights.
He runs at least one red light. This whole 8-mile chase ends up involving multiple CHP cars, LAPD cruisers that join in, and crucially, a police helicopter that's tracking everything from above.
And this is the critical transition point, isn't it? This is where the incident shifts from a high-speed chase started by the CHP to a use-of-force incident involving the Los Angeles Police Department.
Precisely. The pursuit ends, King's car is cornered, and the first 5 LAPD officers arrive. And these officers, they would become globally infamous. You had Sergeant Stacy Kuhn, who was the ranking officer and took command.
Right.
And then officers Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wynn, Theodore Brisno, and Rolando Solano.
Let's really detail that moment when King is pulled from the car, because the officers later argued that his behavior, right then and there, justified everything that came next.
The initial confrontation was chaotic. Officer Melanie Singer of the CHP ordered King and his 2 passengers out of the car. Now, the passengers, Allen and Helms, they complied immediately. They got out, they lay face down on the ground.
But even they had a rough time of it.
They did. It's worth noting that one of them, Brian Allen, he later claimed who was, and I'm quoting, manhandled, kicked, stomped, taunted, and threatened while he was being detained.
Wow.
Helms also got a laceration on his head that needed treatment, so even the compliant passengers were not handled gently.
But King himself, he behaved in a way that the officers saw as non-compliant.
Yes. When King got out, the reports suggest he was acting erratically. He reportedly giggled, he patted the ground, he even waved at the police helicopter overhead.
And this is where Officer Singer.
This is the moment Officer Singer later testified about. She said King grabbed his buttocks, and she immediately thought he was reaching for a weapon.
Even though he was completely unarmed.
Completely unarmed. She drew her pistol, but before she could do anything, Sergeant Kuhn takes command. He orders all the officers to holster their firearms. He's shifting the strategy away from lethal force and towards physical restraint.
And Kuhn immediately goes to what the LAPD called the swarm technique, right?
That's correct. And you have to understand the LAPD jargon here. The swarm was a specific approved tactic. It means multiple officers rush a suspect all at once, using just their empty hands to overwhelm and subdue them quickly.
So Kuhn ordered his officers to do this.
He did, but the officers later claimed during the trial that King physically resisted. They said he stood up and managed to throw them off his back.
Which King and other witnesses disputed.
They disputed that account vehemently, yes.
I think we need to slow down here and really explain those procedural claims. Why did the officers believe this justified the next steps they took?
They relied heavily on the claim that King was showing superhuman strength. This was a very common and often incorrect assumption linked to the use of PCP, or phencyclidine.
Ah, the PCP defense.
Exactly. They testified they believed King was on PCP, which meant, in their minds, standard restraint techniques would fail, and they needed to escalate to using batons immediately.
And we know now that claim was completely false.
Absolutely. The toxicology tests, which were taken about 5 hours after the arrest, they came back negative for PCP. They did find traces of marijuana and a blood alcohol content of 0.075%, which was just under the legal limit at the time, but certainly nothing that would cause the kind of strength the officers alleged.
But it was what they believed in the moment.
It was what they believed. Regardless of the chemical reality, they thought they were dealing with a chemically enhanced threat, and that provided the internal justification for the level of force that followed.
And here's where it gets really, well, it's where the story changes forever. Because despite all those internal justifications, the external reality was captured on video. We move now to the minute and 19 seconds of footage filmed by George Holliday.
This is the moment the narrative just froze in time for the entire world. And it's important to note, the video begins not with the chase, but with the violence already underway.
Right.
The video starts with King already on the ground. He's just been hit by a taser deployed by Sergeant Kuhn. You can even see the taser wire on his body. King then gets up from the ground, and this is the critical, legally debated moment, and he rushes toward Officer Powell.
And the defense and the prosecution clashed so fiercely over what that movement was. Was it an attack, or was he trying to escape?
The prosecution argued King was stunned, confused, maybe trying to flee. The defense argued he was actively charging Officer Powell, framing it as an aggressive assault that required an immediate, overwhelming response. And a collision happens.
And that collision, it seems to be what unleashed the barrage that we all remember.
Immediately after that contact, Powell hits King hard with his baton, knocks him right back down to the pavement. Powell keeps hitting him again and again until Officer Brisno actually steps in for a moment to try and stop him.
But Kuhn overrules him.
Yes. Sergeant Kuhn steps in again, takes command, and he explicitly orders the continued use of batons. He instructs Powell and Wind to use what the LAPD called power strokes.
Can you define power strokes for us? What did that mean in terms of LAPD training?
Power strokes meant full force, unrestrained blows. In theory, LAPD policy said batons should be used to subdue, not to permanently injure. You're supposed to aim for soft tissue. But Kuhn's command was the exact opposite of that. He specifically directed the officers to, and this is a quote, hit his joints, hit the wrists, hit his elbows, hit his knees, hit his ankles.
It's chilling.
It's a directed attack on vulnerable, high-pain areas designed to incapacitate King systematically.
That combination of full force and precision targeting is just harrowing. The statistics from that minute and 19 seconds of video, they're hard to even process.
They're severe. During the time the video is rolling, King was hit with 33 baton blows, and he received 7 kicks. He was only put in handcuffs and cord cuffs after a total of 8 officers finally swarmed him, which is far more than the initial 5 who were on the scene.
We have to pause and just reflect on the sheer physical trauma King endured. Before he was even taken to the hospital, he had a fractured facial bone, a broken right ankle, multiple bruises and lacerations, and a burn on his chest from the stun gun.
The experience wasn't just the physical pain, it was a deep psychological trauma, which, he would carry for the rest of his life. His later negligence claim alleged he had 11 skull fractures and permanent brain damage.
And while King was the central figure, we should circle back to his passengers for a moment.
Yes, Brian Allen was released, and he only received about $35,000 in a civil settlement, even though he claimed he was brutally handled. And Freddie Helms, who got that head laceration that night, he tragically died just a few months later in a completely separate car crash in June of 1991.
Their fates were all sealed by that chase, but only King's story, and that video would redefine the entire nation.
And that incident would have just remained a footnote in a police blotter, a local use of force report, if it wasn't for George Holliday.
Just a plumbing salesman.
Just a plumbing salesman who happened to be testing his new camcorder from his apartment balcony near the intersection of Foothill Boulevard and Osborne Street in Lakeview Terrace.
His actions are the very definition of citizen journalism changing history. He had intended to film something else, but he heard the sirens and the commotion.
Right. And he managed to get his camera, and despite the low light and the distance, he captured the beating as it happened. But what's absolutely astonishing, and it speaks volumes about the LAPD's internal culture then, is what he did next. He called LAPD headquarters 2 days later to offer them the footage.
And they were uninterested.
Completely uninterested. He couldn't find anyone in the department who cared to see evidence of a major use of force incident. Just think about that. The institutional inertia and the indifference to any kind of oversight.
So he took it to KTLA. He took the tape to KTLA, a local news station. A reporter named Warren Wilson immediately saw how important it was, took on the story, and even interviewed King inside the jail ward where he was being held.
And the moment that grainy, shaky, but undeniable footage aired, it became an instant global media sensation. It wasn't just covering the incident, it was the incident.
Exactly. It turned a local police arrest into a national and international mandate to confront police abuse and racial injustice.
The video immediately forced a public response. LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, who, he was famous for leading the department with an iron fist. He was forced to announce publicly that the officers had used excessive force.
And Gates's number was even higher. He estimated they struck King between 53 and 56 times.
Wow.
Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley acted swiftly. He understood the depth of the crisis, and in April 1991, he created the Independent Commission on the Los Angeles Police Department.
This was the famed Christopher Commission, right?
Yeah.
Named after its chairman, Warren Christopher, who would go on to be Secretary of State. What was its scope? The commission's mandate was a full, independent, and fair examination of the entire LAPD. This wasn't just about the King incident. It was about the systemic issues the video had exposed.
So they were looking at everything.
Everything. The department's structure, recruitment, training, internal discipline, how they handled citizen complaints, and the findings were damning. They documented a persistent use of excessive force, racist behavior, and a total failure of leadership to hold officers accountable. The video didn't just expose a few bad officers, it exposed a fundamentally broken system.
And the immediate aftermath also included these details from King's hospital stay that just further eroded public trust.
Yes, King was transferred to Pacifica Hospital, and nurses there reported that the officers who were with him, including Officer Timothy Wynn, were openly joking and bragging about how many times they had hit King.
That kind of reported conduct just reinforces the public perception of impunity, a disturbing disregard for the violence that was inflicted. It suggests a culture where brutality was just normal.
Who was even celebrated in a way.
King himself, he pursued justice through the civil system. He filed a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles for negligence and civil rights violations. And years later, a jury awarded him $3.8 million in damages.
Plus, another $1.7 million in attorney's fees. But while that financial compensation acknowledged the harm, the criminal justice system, well, it was about to deliver a verdict that would rip the city completely apart.
Which leads us directly into the heart of the legal controversy. The trials.
Right. Because of the saturation of media coverage and the intense public outcry in LA, the lawyers for the 4 officers facing state charges, Kuhn, Powell, Wind, and Briseno, They successfully argued for a change of venue.
They managed to move the trial completely out of the diverse population of Los Angeles County.
They moved it to Simi Valley in neighboring Ventura County. The defense argued they couldn't possibly get an impartial jury in LA, and Simi Valley was, and still is, a significantly whiter, wealthier, more conservative suburb. It was a community with a high percentage of residents who had connections to law enforcement or the military.
And the jury that was seated reflected that demographic shift. It became a major point of contention and critique that we still analyze today.
The jury for the state case had 10 white jurors, 1 biracial male, 1 Latino, and 1 Asian American. Now, it's important to note the lead prosecutor for the state, Terry L. White, was black.
Right.
But the demographic makeup of the jury wasn't lost on the public. Many civil rights advocates argued that the jury pool in Simi Valley was inherently biased towards law enforcement from the start.
The verdict came down on April 29, 1992. And the shock and the outrage were just immediate and visceral.
It was devastating. The jury acquitted all 4 officers of assault. 3 of the 4 were acquitted of using excessive force. The jury was only unable to reach a verdict on 1 single charge against Officer Powell.
So the overwhelming message was that the actions caught on that video were almost entirely legally justifiable.
That was a message sent by the court.
How? How? When the video was so clear, could the jury possibly come to that conclusion? That's the million-dollar question that defines this whole moment.
This is where we have to analyze the defense strategy. Legal scholars see it as a cynical but brilliantly executed tactic. The prosecution basically presented the video as self-evident truth. Here is a man being beaten.
But the defense introduced doubt.
They introduced complexity and doubt. Their main strategy was to desensitize the jury to the violence.
How do you desensitize someone to 81 seconds of repeated baton blows?
By taking the emotion completely out of it, the defense played the video, not just once or twice, but dozens of times, frame by frame, often in slow motion. They broke it down into these discrete, technical actions instead of a continuous story of brutality.
The visual evidence stops being damning, and it just becomes technical data points.
Exactly. They overlaid expert testimony, basically giving the jury this continuous authoritative narration, explaining why each specific strike was technically justified under police procedure. They focused heavily on the first few blurry seconds, arguing that King's movement, whether you see it as aggression or flight, justified that very first strike from Powell.
And if that first strike was lawful?
Then, the defense argued, the officers were just acting within policy parameters in response to continued noncompliance.
They successfully reframed Rodney King as the one who was the continued aggressor, who brought the violence on himself by not complying instantly.
Yes. They used the officer's testimony that King had resisted the initial swarm technique before the filming even started. They used that to build a narrative of ongoing, sustained resistance. They argued that because King was big, maybe on drugs, that refuted PCP claim again and actively resisting, that the level of force was necessary for officer safety. And the jury, lacking a diverse perspective and maybe already inclined to trust law enforcement testimony, they accepted that legal framework.
The reaction from public figures was just disbelief. Mayor Tom Bradley said, "The men who beat Rodney King do not deserve to wear the uniform of the LAPD." And President George H.W. Bush said it was hard to understand how the verdict could possibly square with the video.
And that political and public outrage immediately translated into catastrophic civil unrest. Within hours of the acquittals on April 29, 1992, the Los Angeles riots, or the LA uprising, began.
Right, and this wasn't just a reaction to the verdict, was it? It was the culmination of years of systemic issues.
It was. It was the eruption of deep-seated, long-standing rage among racial minorities. It represented the collision of police brutality, high unemployment, political neglect, and the simmering economic and social tensions in Los Angeles. The King verdict was the match, but the tinder had been laid for decades.
A major component of the conflict involved escalating tensions between African Americans and Korean Americans.
It did. The African American community felt that Korean-American business owners, especially in South Central, treated them unfairly, and the riots saw many Korean-owned businesses targeted for looting and burning.
And the response from that community was often self-defense.
Yes, because they felt abandoned by the LAPD. They organized armed protection groups on the rooftops of their stores. It was a city at war with itself.
The scale of the destruction over those 6 days is just staggering.
It was devastating. The official count was 63 people dead, over 2,300 injured, and more than 7,000 fires were set.
Wow.
Damage was reported to over 3,000 businesses, and the total financial losses were close to $1 billion. The violence only ended after massive external reinforcement was deployed. the California Army National Guard, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Marine Corps.
And the anger wasn't just confined to L.A. The uprising spurred smaller disturbances in cities all across the country.
Yeah.
San Francisco, Seattle, Las Vegas.
Even New York City. There was a protest in Toronto, Canada, where demonstrators linked the King acquittal to local incidents of police violence. That verdict was a global catalyst for discussing race and policing.
And amidst all this fire and chaos, the man at the center of it all, Rodney King himself, he makes this extraordinary televised appearance on May 1st, 3 days into the rioting.
It was a moment of just raw vulnerability and desperate moral clarity in a city that was tearing itself apart.
His televised plea is maybe his second most remembered moment after the video itself.
Indeed. He appeared and he made this direct, heartfelt appeal for the violence to stop. And the full quote is just one of the most poignant phrases of that era. He said, "I just want to say, can we all get along? Can we get along?"
He showed this remarkable empathy even then.
He did. He went on, "Can we stop making it horrible for the older people and the kids? And I mean, we've got enough smog in Los Angeles, let alone to deal with setting these fires and things. It's just not right." He specifically mentions seeing a security guard shot on the ground.
It's just not right, because those people will never go home to their families again. Despite everything he had suffered, he didn't advocate for vengeance. He pleaded for peace.
It's a powerful testament to the man, but the state acquittal wasn't the final word on criminal accountability. After the riots, the federal government intervened.
The Department of Justice began seeking indictments for federal civil rights violations, which led to a federal trial in 1993.
Right. And the outcome was different this time. In the federal case, Officer Lawrence Powell and Sergeant Stacy Kuhn were found guilty of violating King's civil rights.
And they were sentenced to prison.
They were sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. Officers Timothy Wind and Theodore Bransonow were acquitted of all charges in the federal case. But their careers were over. Both were quickly dismissed by the LAPD.
But the sentencing in that federal trial, delivered by Judge John G. Davies, it became almost as controversial as the initial state verdict.
It was hugely controversial because Judge Davies used his discretion to drastically reduce the sentences. He accepted much of the defense's argument, concluding that the first 55 seconds of the beating, most of the blows, were lawful because King was resisting.
Wait, so he ruled that only the final 6 baton blows were unlawful?
That's right. The officers were convicted, but the judge's interpretation dramatically minimized the scope of their crime. They were convicted, but the court said 90% of what they did was actually lawful.
That's a profound paradox.
It is, and that distinction between the lawful force and the few unlawful final strikes, it drastically impacted the sentence. Federal guidelines called for 70 to 87 months. Kuhn and Powell got only 30.
Why did Judge Davies reduce it so much?
He cited extensive mitigation factors. He essentially viewed the officers as victims of public scrutiny. He mentioned the suffering they'd gone through, their high legal bills, the loss of their careers, and the higher risks they'd face in prison.
So after the federal convictions, King had some financial compensation and saw 2 of the officers serve time. But that didn't erase his deep personal struggles.
It's so vital to recognize the deep psychological scars King carried. That money did not buy him peace. He struggled profoundly with alcoholism and drug addiction for years after the beating, which led to this persistent string of arrests.
He tried to use some of the money constructively, right? A record label.
He did. He invested in a failed record label, Straight Altapaz Records. He hoped to create jobs for minority youth, but most of the money was eventually lost.
And his later legal setbacks, they were mostly tied to his addiction and trauma.
In 1992, he was arrested for injuring his wife, Crystal King, though no complaint was filed. The next year, 1993, he was convicted of DUI after crashing his car into a wall, an accident that broke his pelvis.
And it continued through the mid-90s.
It did. In 1995, he was convicted of hit and run after hitting Crystal with his car during a fight. He got 90 days in jail for that. This pattern just shows the profound instability he was dealing with. Then, years later, in 2007, he suffered another terrifying assault when he was shot in the face, arms, and back with birdshot pellets during a robbery attempt.
We did eventually see him confront these demons publicly, though.
He did. In 2008, he checked into the Pasadena Recovery Center and appeared on the TV show Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew and its spin-off, Sober House.
And that gave him a platform to talk about his addiction and the trauma.
Yes. And there was this deeply symbolic moment where he and Dr. Drew physically retraced his path on the night of the beating all the way to the exact spot where it happened, confronting the physical side of his trauma.
And there's that fascinating personal detail that surfaced in 2010 when he married Cynthia Kelly. The source material says she had actually been a juror in his civil suit against the city.
It's an almost unbelievable detail, a bizarre coming together of his public and private lives. He also tried to seize control of his own narrative, publishing his memoir in 2012, The Riot Within: My Journey from Rebellion to Redemption.
But sadly, that journey ended tragically on Father's Day, June 17th, 2012. He was just 47. His partner, Cynthia Kelly, found him dead at the bottom of his swimming pool.
The autopsy really provided a medical explanation for this tragic end, and it linked his death directly back to his long-standing struggles. The official cause was accidental drowning, but it was compounded by several significant factors.
Those factors included alcohol, cocaine, and PCP found in his system, and an existing serious heart condition.
Specifically, cardiomegaly, an enlarged heart and myocardial fibrosis. The official conclusion was a combination of things. The effects of the drugs and alcohol, combined with his heart condition, probably caused a cardiac arrhythmia, and incapacitated in the water, he was unable to save himself. It was a tragic convergence of his long-term health issues and his lifelong struggle with addiction.
Looking back at his legacy, King remained such a complex figure. He became this unwilling global symbol of police brutality, but he himself recognized the impossible weight of that role.
He was quoted recognizing that duality. He said, "Some people feel like I'm some kind of hero, others hate me, they say I deserved it. Other people, I can hear them mocking me like I'm a fool for believing in peace."
He was never just the victim. He was an object onto which the entire country projected its political and racial tensions.
And while the media often reduced him to that symbol, his family has consistently emphasized the human element. They insist he was a human, not a symbol.
And that insistence is carried on in one of the most lasting positive efforts that grew from this tragedy, the work of his daughter, Laura King.
Laura King started the Rodney King Foundation, and she actively works directly with the LAPD to build bridges between the police and the Black community. She's trying to achieve the reconciliation her father pleaded for back in 1992.
It's a powerful legacy of hope. And it proves that King himself never advocated for hatred or violence against the police. His central message was always that question, can we all get along?
It is.
It's also impossible to analyze the King incident without looking at its massive cultural footprint.
Yeah.
The influence across film, television, music, it's just immense.
The visual evidence was so potent that it was instantly integrated into the cultural lexicon. In film, you saw snippets of Holiday's video immediately in Spike Lee's Malcolm X in 1992, using it to underscore the ongoing struggle for civil rights.
You also see references in films like Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, the police thriller Dark Blue, and the NWA biopic Straight Outta Compton. The riots themselves became the subject of major documentaries like LA 92.
And television reacted quickly, too. The aftermath of the riots was the setting for an episode of Doogie Howser, MD, of all things. More recently, the entire narrative of the King verdict opened the series The People v. O.J. Simpson, emphasizing how this incident created the volatile racial landscape for the Simpson trial a few years later.
And the music industry. It provided some of the most raw and immediate emotional responses.
Absolutely. Artists across all genres spoke out. Ice Cube, in his 1991 song Alive on Arrival, talks about fearing a similar fate. Ice-T's group Body Count released the highly controversial song Cop Killer, which directly referenced both King and Chief Daryl Gates, articulating that sheer, unfiltered rage.
And the riots specifically inspired songs that became classics.
Dr. Dre's album The Chronic had The Day the Niggas Took Over, which is all about the looting and anger after the verdict. The ska punk band Sublime's song April 29, 1992 was written entirely about the rioting. It had a massive cross-genre impact. Even contemporary music, like Guy Sebastian's song Get Along, uses King's quote as its central message.
It's clear the incident just became this cultural shorthand for institutional failure and civil unrest. It remains a crucial touchstone for understanding race, policing, and the power of media in modern America.
Absolutely.
We have looked at the full cycle of this tragic event, the abuse of power, the critical role of the camera, the shocking state acquittal, the firestorm of the riots, and then that eventual, if partial, federal justice. This specific incident didn't just expose a problem. It paved the way for modern discussions about civilian oversight, and crucially, it solidified the role of citizen video as the ultimate tool for police accountability.
And if we connect this historical moment to where we are today, it raises a profound question for all of us. We primarily know Rodney King through 81 seconds of blurry, distant video captured by one man, George Holliday, in 5 pleading words. When that video was filmed, it was a rare event. One person with one amateur camera. Today, nearly everyone has a high-definition phone camera. Everyone is capable of recording and instantly broadcasting any police interaction. So what does that shift from a single accidental documentarian to this ubiquitous recording capability? What does that truly mean for achieving accountability and justice today? And what burden does that mass documentation place on the communities that are forced to record it?
We hope this comprehensive analysis has been valuable in understanding this pivotal moment in American history and its enduring ripple effects. Thanks for listening.